Hello all, and it's time for one of my short bits. Today we're talking about one of the most overused plot lines in sci-fi. A plot line so overused that most magazines specifically list it as one of their "we're going to automatically reject it." What is this plot? Adam and Eve. Maybe your astronauts crash landed on a world and the man is named Adam and the woman is named Eve. Or maybe they're the last humans held by aliens who killed everyone else. Maybe they're in the far future. Oh, so far in the past that the writer can talk about constellations that would not be familiar for thousands of years. But fundamentally, it's grabbing the idea of the biblical origin story, dressing it up in a spacesuit with a jetpack, and retelling it. Again, and again, and again. It's probably one of the first gotcha stories, and like all gotcha stories, it works once. But every writer at some point in their career will think of an Adam and Eve story, probably because it is such a deep part of Western culture. After all, for a lot of kids, they hear it first in Sunday school. And pretty soon, unfortunately, readers weren't so much, "oh cool," as, "oh God, not this again." So were the editors, who remember, saw vastly more stories than are ever printed, and so they probably saw vastly more Adam and Eve twist endings. Now, even in this immense wasteland of doe-eyed Eve staring at their manly Adams, there were some standouts. We have Adam and No Eve by Alfred Bester, 1941, and he managed to turn the concept on its head by having the last man of a past Earth survive, but he had no Eve because he had sort of accidentally killed everybody else. And when he died, it was the germs from his rotting carcass that would eventually remake the Earth we know and love as they dispersed into the ocean. So we have an Adam, but no Eve. Pretty smart, and it was also turned into a radio production and a comic story. You can take a look at the link to the comic story in my description. But most stories weren't like that. More often, it was a fairly simple storyline. Event happens, mankind is either accidentally or deliberately zorched, and two people live, one man, one woman, strangely familiar names, optional, but actually pretty common. But there's something interesting about this theme, that being how completely many of these stories diverge from the actual meaning of the original myth. After all, anyone who has read Genesis knows that Adam and Eve didn't leave the garden voluntarily. They were kicked out for a fundamental failure to follow the rules. They screwed up, which pretty much defines how things go from there in the myth of the fall of man. But the Adams and Eves of science fiction are as often as not heroic figures, not screw-ups. In Jack Williamson's Born of the Sun, in Astounding Magazine, 1934, the hero battles valiantly to save humanity and finds his girlfriend hiding from the hordes of cultists who had attempted to ensure that humanity would die. But they don't. No, from their love and the giant starship he built, future generations of mankind will spring from this latter-day Adam and Eve. By the way, if you want, read this story. It's very dated in some cases, including some, well, let's just say Oriental cults, quote unquote, were very common in stories of this time period, but it's still an interesting and fun read. Later, we have the example of Evolution's End by Robert Arthur in 1941. In that story, the great brain rulers of humanity start going mad as their brains grow too large. And so the slaves Adam and Eva were sent to the surface to start a new humanity while their overseer destroyed the underground cities of the rulers. Again, very much portrayed as the worthy survivors of the fallen world. We're not really going to talk about inbreeding and genetic diversity when we're talking about Adam and Eve stories. But what I'm talking about is that these Adam and Eve stories aren't simply stories about Adam and Eve in the biblical sense. They're a mixture of Adam and Eve and Noah. Yes, we have the concept of one man and one woman surviving to rebuild humanity, but the setup is often closer to Noah, being heroes surviving a great catastrophe and proving worthy to continue on, as opposed to, being the screw-ups that Adam and Eve were. Now, it could just be that sci-fi writers don't generally like to start with their heroes being tossed out of paradise as the doors are slammed behind them and a flaming no trespassing sign is erected. But it's still an interesting case of science fiction taking a very well-known story and putting something of a different spin on it. Just remember, if you submit a story with Adam and Eve or any possible permutation of those names, don't be surprised if it comes sailing back with a very annoyed rejection letter attached.